right.
All right, Dr. Frame, I think the group is all yours.
Oh, thank you. Well, if you have any questions, either unmute your mic and just chime in or type a box and I'll be able to see the question. Now, I've got this on a full screen mode, so it'd be easier if you all unmuted your mic and just shouted out a question, because I don't check this very often as I'm trying to keep as much of the screen in front of you as I can. All right, so the continuing on EMS operations, we now move to preparing for the ambulance call. Now, for those who did not attend the last roundtable that I gave, we covered EMS operations, slides 1 through 10. And it really had to do with pretty much the environment, what chemicals are defined as, who Chemtrec is, and such like that. The only time that I've ever seen a question really on the chemical substances themselves is for the common ones. The 1203, which is gasoline or any of the flammable petroleum products, or the 1,3-butadiene, which is a very strong carcinogen, chlorine gas, propane 1075, and some of the other placards that you see out on the road. As you drive along, of course, pay attention to the road, but also note that if you've got any kind of tanker going past you or any kind of open-ended high-end chassis, a Ford 550, 650, 750, or even a semi-tractor chassis, where there you see stacked H bottles in the back. Those are the real tall bottles that contain compressible gases. Some are flammable, some are not flammable. Some support combustion, such as oxygen. So just oxygen being released from a bottle isn't going to cause a fire. But if the same oxygen bottle is opened during a fire, you're going to have a very bright fire going, that's for sure. So oxygen will support that. So what I'd like you to do is, in your travels, in the time that you study, look over the last video lecture that we gave. You can even silence me on the other end if you'd like, but pick up the key terms such as volatility and persistence and such like that. Now, you'll see that the National Registry categorizes EMS operations as one of your big 7 of the subjects that they test. EMS operations, as it relates to just what we just talked about with chemical hazards, and it's not memorizing chemistry or anything like that. You're not going to be asked any questions like that, but just recognizing the common terminology, or what we call nomenclature, fancy word for terminology that you use, so that when you are reading either firefighting stuff, if you're in the fire side of the EMS house, or from a private ambulance standpoint, or even a private ambulance responding to 911, these are all going to have articles and continuing education and such that will use these terms. And you'll get 1 or 2 definitions. Persistency and volatility are the ones that appear the most. Cycle 6 has just come up. The emphasis is going to be in various areas for each subject. And as I hit each subject with you, since I'm one of the guys that write questions for the National Registry, I can tell you that this time around with EMS operations, the first 10 slides that we went over the last time you're probably going to see a couple of definitions. You'll definitely get the question that everybody gets in every exam. This is the Chemtrec phone number. And who is Chemtrec and what do they do? And that's about it. Now, when it comes to preparing for the ambulance call, of all the areas of EMS operations, this one's hit probably the heaviest. Now, you may get one question on positioning of apparatus. Watch the uphill, downhill thing, especially when it comes to chemical spills or any type of hazardous material incident where you're going to have to be upwind and uphill. Some of the more volatile and poisonous gases that are out there are heavier than air. Subsequently, they'll sink. And if you're caught in any low areas, you're going to have 99 more problems going on, including your own crew collapsing. So probably best to memorize how you're going to position your apparatus if you come across a hazardous material incident where they purposefully describe the scenario on the National Registry question as being in a low-lying area. And when it comes to blocking apparatus, that's really an SOP, and we tend at the National Registry level to stay away from blocking apparatus, except to say you'd like to have at least one blocking apparatus out there. So if you're an ambulance on a multi-vehicle accident up on an interstate, you kind of like to have that 26 or 32 tons of apparatus from the fire department sitting back about 300 feet blocking traffic, or 100 feet or such. Just enough room for everybody to function around, but not so far away where the unaware driver goes around the fire apparatus and thinks they can jump back into the right lane or into the left lane, and next thing you know, they're right on you. So blocking apparatus is important, a safe distance away from the ambulance, and of course, protection for all the folks that are on the scene. Now, one of the big EMS operations question that we have is who's best suited to run an incident on an interstate or a major highway, to position apparatus, to call for more resources, and of course to make assignments. And the answer to that universally is going to be incident commander. And an incident commander is generally the senior firefighter or officer of that jurisdiction on the scene. So it's usually a fire chief, an operations chief, a battalion chief. It'll say something along the line of senior firefighter. So be looking for the answer that has to do with fire department. I gave an oral scenario exam for terminal competency to a young man probably about 5 or 6 months ago, who described to me that when they get on the scene, they generally take it over because the fire department is incompetent. That may be so in that jurisdiction, but for the purposes of the National Registry exam, 99% of the fire departments are competent and handle incident command pretty well. Subsequently, especially with NIMS 101, 102, 105, 106, 107, 108, those are very, very important EMS operations learning skills that you need to know. So if you don't have your NIMS, get on the .gov website that has to do with NIMS 101, 102, 107, 108, at least complete those. If you're embedded in the fire service or you're in any kind of civil position that has to do with emergency management, you'll find that NIMS 3 and 4 are going to be very, very important. ICS 300, ICS 400, NIMS, incident command system are very important, because to be a fire officer, especially at fire officer 1, 2, or 3 levels, you'll need at least that experience in commanding both single incidents as well as major incidents. I'm not talking about tornadoes devastating a town or anything like that, although the concept is the same, ICS is used. We're talking 1 or 2 vehicles on a highway versus 6, 7, 10, including heavy trucks on an interstate. I think you can see that the stress level for everybody involved is going to be higher. But the more dangerous situation is going to be the onesie twosies. Now that again may appear on your exam. It's something that we wrote this year and we liked the question, so we're going to try it. It's going to be when is the firefighter, when is the paramedic most vulnerable on a car accident or any type of vehicle incident on a high-speed roadway, such as an interstate. When are you guys most vulnerable to accidents? It's going to be at night, on the rain or snow, depending on where you're at, and without blocking apparatus, without the proper amount of police department, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be a pretty good common sense question. Okay, with that introduction, what I want to talk about now is preparing for the ambulance call. So you're sitting at the station, you're sitting at wherever you're at base for your 24 on 48 off, or hopefully the more progressive agencies going 48-96. But let's say you're still 24 and 48, and then all of a sudden the bells ring or the klaxon goes off, or whatever you guys use to alert you in the stations, and you're going to be responding to an accident. The first thing you want to do in the morning before that call comes in is prepare for the ambulance call. Now, here's the beauty. I think this is probably emphasized a little bit too much, but on the National Register, they seem to place an unusual amount of emphasis on what you need to do in the morning to make sure that you're ready to take on the day, the duty day. So first things first, if they're going to, if the question is presented to you that who regulates ambulances and what's on the ambulances, it's going to be the state agency. Here in Texas, it's DSHS, Department of State Health Services, DSHS. In Illinois, it's IDPH, Illinois Department of Public Health. And in some jurisdictions, it's even the Department of Transportation, such as Florida. If anybody's from Florida and you got a different take on it, let me know. But that was the last that we knew about that. The registry exam is not going to ask you, you're in this state, who's your agency? Because they could pick Rhode Island, and with everybody else in the rest of the country, they're going to go, what? What's Rhode Island? So don't worry about that part. Just know that from an administrative law standpoint, anything regulatory that has to do with the ambulances is state EMS regulatory agency. That's the way the answer is going to be phrased. In the first bullet that I have, the last 4 words of that first bullet, state EMS regulatory agency, as your trigger words. I'd write it down verbatim. If you see it, it's probably the answer. All right. The ambulance check is just going to be exactly that. You're going to check everything. And you want to make sure that everything is functional, all the oxygen bottles are filled, the monitor is working, the batteries have been changed out, low batteries being charged batteries being replaced, even if you didn't use them for the day. Discharge the battery completely. If they say, well, we didn't have any runs yesterday, okay, fine. You're still obligated to check these batteries and such. Now, what you see the fellow doing here is checking the body of the ambulance, wheels, tires, and windshield wipers. That first line there, check the ambulance body, wheels, tires, and windshield wipers, is actually an answer on the exam. Now, remember, when you sign up for the exam, there's 4,000 questions sitting in the cloud, and they're all waiting to come down for you to sign in. And as soon as you sign in at that Pearson Center and say, I'm ready to take this exam, 150 questions come floating down from the cloud. Random order, random selection, all the questions validated. You may run into 1 or 2 experimentals, but you won't know that. But I can't tell you for sure that this question is going to appear on your test. Some of the things that I mentioned, such as Chemtrek, persistency, volatility, warm zone, hot zone, cold zone, those universally are in what they call a mandatory bank. In other words, that part of the bank where those questions come down for everybody. because it's important enough for everybody to know that. So the first 10 slides. But after that, you may get a variation on some of these. The key on this particular picture is that you're going to be checking the exterior of the ambulance, and it has to include windshield wipers, tires, wheels, air pressure in the wheels, obviously, and the body of the ambulance itself. You'd hate to respond to a call and have your stuff hanging out. It'd be embarrassing as well as dangerous. Okay, engine off. Get me down there. Let's see, contact. Okay, pressure gauge. Really, this last sentence, use a pressure gauge. That's the only thing that you really have to know on this slide. And let me see what I got here on my National Registry notes here, what we're using this year. Nope, and nope. So nothing from that standpoint. Latches, locks, broken glass, loose, missing parts, and these are all intuitive. If you see something like, gee, what should you replace? And it tells you that you got 18 cracks in the windshield. Okay, that's probably a big clue that you should probably be looking at that. You're not going to get a National Registry question that says that, though. They're just going to ask, what should you be checking? And the answer is pretty much everything. You're not going to be changing transmission oil or checking brake pads, and you don't have to pull the wheels off the vehicles every day. That's not what routine daily crews do. That's either what the shops do, or you got a mechanic in the house, or whoever's in charge of that kind of heavy maintenance. Your job is just to make sure you got the safe stuff. The headlights are working. Your woo-woo lights are working. The siren's working. The windshield wipers are working, and they're not coming over in 3 and 4 different pieces, leaving rubber all over the place. And you just want to make sure your turn signals, brake lights are working. Of course, you want to make sure your brakes are working. It's always a plus, especially when you're going through an intersection. All right. Wipe down the steering wheel with disinfectant. You might see this. Everybody's COVID paranoid. As you know, the country has lost its mind over the past year over a virus that wasn't going to be stopped, that can't be stopped. Once it's airborne, you're done. CDC has been going backwards in time trying to figure out, when did that virus arrive? And so they've been pulling blood samples of blood donors. People actually go to blood centers and say, here, I'll donate a pint of blood. And they've been tracing back samples from early November of 2019. Now, if we are to believe, I'm not going to get political on you here, but I am scientific. If we're to believe that these folks came over from whatever country the virus may have originated from, they get settled in. As soon as you get off the airplane, the ship, or however you got here from the foreign country, you don't generally get out of the airport, take your bags and say, take me to a blood center. Okay, that usually takes about 4 to 6 weeks for those folks to finally say, hey, I need to donate blood. So the feeling right now is that COVID got here sometime in October of 2019, well before it became a political football, more importantly, well before we were even aware of the fact that whatever country had the virus to begin with allowed it to spread all over the world. As you know, Italy, Spain, UK, boy, they took a beating, and you know it was going to end up here. All right, I see one question popped up. Let's see who. On shift tonight, we'll say bye if I catch a run. It's cool. Same with me, I'll let you know. Good deal. All right. Okay. Now, they want you to inspect the battery. For those of you who are my age, we used to have to take all 6 little caps off and take a little distilled water and spray them into each one to bring them up. Now, as life has gone on, batteries are no longer having to have that level of maintenance. You usually have to just polish off the little window. If the indicator's green, you're good to go. If you're a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more mechanically inclined, you get into the ambulance, you start it up, and you look at the voltmeter to see if your electrical system is doing what it's supposed to do. Battery starts it, alternator continues everything. Alternator dies, voltage drops, you start running off the battery, next thing you know, no more battery. So you won't get that on the exam from what I just described with voltmeters, alternators, generators, and batteries and electrical systems, but you will get that the battery check is part of your daily maintenance routine check in the morning. So in addition to your headlights, turn signals, windshield wiper fluids, brake fluids, your lights, your siren, air in the tires, now we've got the battery. And all you're going to do is just check to make sure it's green. Okay. Oh, they already said that here. Check the fuel level. I don't know what, that's a department SOP as far as fuel. You will not get a question on fuel. Check under the hood. I think she's demonstrating either an oil or a transmission check here. Piece of cake. It's not hard. It's not rocket surgery. Okay, engine on, same thing. It's all going to be intuitive. And like I said earlier, you're going to be testing the park and brake. Turn the steering wheel from side to side. You should be able to feel a little soft as you go. Your little play in the wheel shouldn't be any more than an inch. Either way, maybe 2 inches if your vehicle's 60, 70, 80,000 miles. But if you can go a quarter turn on the steering wheel before the wheels even begin to think about turning, you got a problem. Okay. And let's see, four-way flashers, blah, blah, blah. All of this, again, intuitive. And of course, as you change out the batteries on your monitor, defibrillator, possibly your glucometer, if you have an iStat machine or if you're running with advanced critical care paramedics, community paramedics, or air medical evac, you'll probably be using lactic acid, troponins, electrolytes. All of those instrumentations either sit inside chargers because they have a lithium battery in them that's chargeable, or if you're really backdating yourself from NiCad batteries from my time in the 70s as a paramedic, you'll find that it's not so much what kind of battery you got. What the National Registry is interested in, is that you've checked the batteries. So, and of course, all your inventory and supplies, and then the drug box, and then the narcotic counts. Any narcotic scheduled medications such as fentanyl, morphine, they're all scheduled to. Ketamine, Versed, these are all accountable medications. They're going to give you 4 or 5 answers to a medications, and they're going to say which one is not part of the drug box check every day, and the answer is they're going to come up with something like lidocaine, cardizem, adenosine, something like that, mixed in the middle of morphine, fentanyl, ketamine, Versed, or Valium, depending on which protocols are doing. The objective here isn't to look for the exact answer. The objective here is to look for your best answer. The best answer isn't always the best answer, but it's better than the other 4. Be alert for those questions and be prepared for it. For instance, not to divert from EMS operations, but I'm going to give you one actual question. And that has to do with the opportunity to look and see what your best equipment is for. So the scenario is going to be after intubation, you check bilateral breath sounds, you verify there's an absence of breath sounds, you can see fogging in the tubes, you see an equal bilateral chest rise. You then put the patient on an indicator. Of the following, what is the best indicator to show proper placement of the ET tube? The answers are going to be pulse oximetry, colorimetric, cardiac monitor, and then they're going to come up with a 4th one, which is really bizarre, like a glucometer or something. Yeah, good move. Where is ETCO2? We know Untitled CO2 is the best way to indicate it, but it wasn't listed here. What's the second best? Colorimetric. Subsequently, if you don't see ETCO2 and they're asking for the best one, you're going after the best answer of the group. And I just gave you one of the questions to the exam. They're looking for the best answer to the group of possible answers. They're not looking for the best. If they wanted the absolute drop dead, no kidding, what's the best of the best, and it was a fill in the blank, you put down Untitled CO2. That's not what this question asks. Watch for that trick question. We try not to get tricky on the National Registry, but every once in a while they say, hey, do you know your top 3 choices? ETCO2, colorimetric, and pulse oximetry. That's just one of the natures of the test. All right, let's see what else you got here. And then, of course, chain of command. Understand always you have a chain of command. And unless it's Jim Frame's ambulance service, where Jim Frame is the driver, the paramedic, and the mechanic, unless it's my service, I have nobody to run it up the flagpole to. If you're working for an agency or for a municipality or a fire protection district or even a county agency, you got to have a chain of command. And one of the questions that were written, although I don't know that it appears on everybody's exams, it's not a mandatory bank, but I've seen it on multiple occasions, has to do with, now that you've found all these problems, who do you give it to? Your partner, your mom, your dad, dog catcher, the mayor, the city manager. And there's a couple layers in between there, between you and the city manager, you and the mayor. And I would venture to say it's probably an immediate supervisor. So if you're the paramedic in charge that day, if you're the field training officer, if you're the lieutenant or the senior paramedic or whatever your role is, there's always somebody above you. That's who gets these reports, and that's going to be on certain exams. Your supervisor, the next up the chain of command. If there's a lieutenant in the house, great. If there's a captain in the house, wonderful. If you only answer to a chief, give it to him. All right. Don't mean to be beating a dead horse here, but this is something that's, again, you blow EMS operations, you fail it, you pass the other 6 areas, and you fail the exam. Why? Because you have to have a passing score in all 7 areas. Airway management, trauma, cardiology, respiratory therapy, OB-GYN, EMS operations. These are all part of it. You need a passing score in each area, and you need a passing score overall. A 90% on 6 subject areas with a 50% on EMS operations means you got the big F. Okay. All right. So let's move on to receiving and responding to the call. There's such an entity out there called the emergency medical dispatcher. Now, the emergency medical dispatcher is somebody who has gone through a 40-hour class on how to handle EMS calls. So they'll pick up the phone and they'll say, this is 911, what's your emergency? I need an ambulance. Okay, ma'am, tell me what's going on. Or I'm sorry, tell me what the address is. You want the location first so I can punch you out and get your wheels rolling towards the scene. And then as she or he talking to the emergency medical dispatcher, the EMD, emergency medical dispatcher, follows an algorithm through a very large file system. So if the patient's complaining of chest pain, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, you flip the red cards. If it's a trauma, you might flip the blue cards. And if it's pediatrics, you go right to green. If it's CPR, you go right to whatever color we got it. And they go right to that. And then they start asking questions and directing what you should be doing, what the caller should be doing for the patient on the scene, gathering more information. That's when you usually get the call on the radio. You're responding to 123 South Main Street for an injured person. That should be enough to get you out the door. So then you go out the door, light sirens and all the other safety things that you do. And then about halfway to the call, you get the dispatcher comes back on and says, hey, you got a 50-year-old male fell off a ladder. Wife is attending to him right now. The patient is breathing, but he's not conscious. I mean, they'll give you a lot more. The purpose of that is to also alert you to the fact that it's a 50-year-old male twisted his ankle and fell, or like this guy did one day, riding a bicycle, brake didn't work, hit a curb, flipped over, went into some bushes. Okay, where did he go? I don't know, he's in the bushes somewhere. Somebody go find him. The bottom line is that if I come out of it with just a sprained ankle, slow down, take it easy. There's two reasons why those dispatchers are doing their job. Number one, to see if there is an indication to put a sense of urgency into the run and get you there just a little quicker. Or second, to slow you down, because this is just not one of those life-threatening situations. And it gives you a better idea when you're pulling up what you might be up against. Well, yeah, there's a man laying outside. He's unconscious on the ground. Okay, they call back then later and say, police is on the scene. There's 40 people rioting. Okay, you may handle that one just a tad different than you would for the 70-year-old man that may have collapsed inside the home. And police are on the scene and they're advising that the patient's having a hard time breathing. It's good to know what you're going to be running up against before you get on the scene. And if you think pulling up to a scene with 40 people rioting is something strange, you haven't been watching the news in the last year. Okay, so they'll also tell you what they've probably done for the patient. Now, I'm not a big fan of that type of traffic, radio traffic. Usually that's some sort of scrambled channel that you might on, or dispatch may say switch to fire ground or switch to EMS ground or whatever other alternate channel that you have, where they can sit there and chat with you all day. But you got to watch the HIPAA thing. You got to watch that there's a gazillion people out there at scanners. And so they're going to give you the essence of what you need to at least get out the door. When you face a question on the National Registry that says the job of the emergency medical dispatcher, you see these questions. They're going to have a variety of these questions sitting there as distractors, in other words, answer choices. And your job is going to be to see which one of those questions an emergency medical dispatcher would not be likely to ask, such as, do you really have to know the person's name over the radio? They may ask for a social security number. They're going to ask for something stupid. You're going to be able to recognize the answer pretty quick. If they tell you it's a 50-year-old female, I think that covers the patient's sex. So you're not going to get hit with something rudimentary such as that. Right now, I just saw somebody pop up with some questions here, and I can't understand why I can't pull this up. Yeah, there you are.
You see them? I can read them if you can't find them.
I got them. Okay, Andrew tells me, does the COVID-19 death toll reported in the news account for the possibility of deaths in October, November, December of 2019 before we knew to look for and test for coronavirus? Was there a notable and unexplained increase in mortality nationwide during those months? The answer is yes. However, we saw an increase, an uptick in mortality, but as you know, September, October, November, December, what else is occurring at that time? All the childhood diseases, mumps, measles, German measles, chickenpox, Fifth's disease, all that other happy stuff. And then for the adults, you get influenza A and B. And then everybody gets a smattering of RSV. 95% of the RSV cases are out there in the children, and that comes in fall to early winter. So when we started seeing an increase in mortality, and as we're swabbing people, we're like, hey, how come I'm only getting a 10% positive rate of influenza here rather than the 90% that we usually see, or 80%? And when I'm putting people on Tamiflu, how come they're not getting better? As a matter of fact, some of them got worse. And then I had a surprising number of people come in who were African American, Hispanic American, Asian Americans, COPDers, diabetics, and renal failure patients. All of a sudden, I'm seeing a normal number of patients with those demographics. And then we started saying, boy, we're losing a lot of people. What's going on? And that's when the World Health Organization backtracked and figured out that we had a virus that came in from whatever country. So your question is very valid, Andrew. Was there a notable unexplained increase in mortality nationwide during those months? Yes. Influenza usually carries about a 2.5% to 3% mortality, some, plus or minus given the demographics of the country. And yet we had a virus here that was in Italy, Spain, and the UK that was responsible for 14-15% mortality. And we thought, Jesus, we got something on the lines of smallpox here, which carries a 30-35% mortality. Certainly wasn't Ebola, which carries a 95% mortality. But at the same time, something else was going on. It was just about at that point in late December, early January that somebody figured out, or somebody admitted, hey, we think one of our viruses escaped from the lab. Can you guys look into this? And they found patient 0, I believe it was in China, but it didn't matter by that time. It was already in Italy, Spain, and the UK. And oh, by the way, a lot of those folks came to America. So the uptick in mortality, we were starting to see hospitals filled up. And yeah, at first we were sitting 10-15% ourselves. As we got testing more and more patients and more people, we're saying, well, maybe this isn't 15%. It looks like it's more like it's 7%. Now we tested more people and found out that they were all negative. And then it got down to its current rate, which is 1% or less, unless you fall into one of those other demographics where your risk of death is higher. Now, from Christian, we established a Code 3 driving policy this year, establishes rules for when to go to emergencies and when not. It has reduced our Code 3 responses significantly, improving safety. Smart move. SOPs. Back in my day, we ran Cadillac or Oldsmobile lowboy ambulances. We didn't use the vans, we didn't use the boxes, because back then, everything was throw and go. And the best that we had out there were EMTs. It wasn't until paramedics really hit the scene throughout the country that we first moved to these weird looking vans, and then ultimately went to the big Frasers or big Hortons or some of the other big boxes that are out there. And if it was a pretty sophisticated county where the ambulance was hospital based, then you had a LA County Squad 51 kind of thing where paramedics would roll out of a fire station and an ambulance would come from the hospital. They'd all meet up at the address. And if it was something paramedics had to get involved with, they went with the ambulance. If it didn't, it didn't. Two-tiered response. Well, that's fine if you've got a whole lot of money where you can afford to do that. But as a result, people had to get creative, and they figured out, gee, we don't have to do 130 miles per hour anymore. Imagine us going down 71st Street in Chicago where there's 10,000 cars at any time. Half of them know how to drive, and trying to weave in and out of traffic. I got to tell you that the guys in the back that were riding with the patient, I mean, everybody came out of it and just pale, diaphoretic. I mean, those were some hairy rides back then. And of course, if the ambulance did rack up, it killed a lot of people. So yeah, I'm glad that you got an SOP that says that if you travel 5 miles and you do 60 miles per hour, you can get there in 5 minutes. And if you do 70 miles per hour, you're going to get there in 4 minutes and 50 seconds. So I'm going to go 10 miles per hour faster, burn up that much more gas, put everybody on the road at that much risk to save 10 seconds? I don't think so. Speed limits. Emergency vehicles are given a little latitude, but these days, even the police are getting nervous about people that are going at 60, 70, 80 miles per hour when they don't need to be going that fast. That's just plain old reckless. Okay. Service uses priority dispatch, which cut our response time about half. Yep. Priorities. And that's the way it has to be now with cities running out of money, the country teetering on 22 trillion in debt, and there just isn't that much money to go around anymore. Subsequently, we got to get creative, but we got to be sensible about how we do things. And one of the great ones that you just mentioned, Tim, was priority dispatch. If we don't have to send an ambulance, Uber them, do something. But we don't need to be wasting 911 resources. You guys are too valuable to be carting people around. That's the cabulance. People call up, yeah, well, I've been sick all week, but I thought I'd go to the hospital, so I call 911. We're all expected to jump out of bed at 2 in the morning and go racing down there for what? Sprained ankle? It doesn't fly. All right, the standard flu. Yep. I'm still in my online course. How are paramedics and EMTs changing to protect themselves from COVID? Okay, so Sydney, as soon as everybody lost their mind with COVID and everybody figured out, geez, that 15% mortality coming out of Spain, Portugal, and Italy, especially. And of course, we can't get true numbers out of the China because they're communists, obviously, and it's a political system that stays tight-lipped about a lot of things. But if you look at Italy and the UK and Spain, where they had the 15% for a while, everybody felt if this thing's carrying a 15% mortality rate, we're going to start dropping paramedics and firefighters all over the place. So frontline nurses and doctors and everybody got into glasses and protective equipment. Some people showed up in respirators. Some of them looked like they were TIE fighter pilots with the big helmets and the big hoses and everything. And they come walking into a room. You don't know who the hell was behind the costume. And gloves, and they were just dressed to the nines. And everybody was saying, we're the N95. These guys are showing up with M50s. If there's anybody that's listening to this lecture right now as military, you know what an M50 is. It's what we use in chemical hazard incidents in the military. So if you're in a chemical, biological, or nuclear environment and such, the M50 filters out everything. You look like a big bug. It's got 2 big discs, but they're safe. They're good. In any event, everybody went PPE crazy. And then we decided only one person is going to go in the building. They're going to check out the scene. And if the person has a fever, cough, congestion, they fit within a demographic and it looked like they were a COVID patient, of course, we had no way to test for it, we would tell them, stay home and quarantine. But I really have to go to the hospital. I'm dying. Yeah, sorry. So that's the way we first approached that. Then we started getting a little bit better about it and went, well, maybe we don't need the gown. Maybe we don't need all this stuff. Yeah, it's airborne, but a good N95 and a pair of gloves and safety glasses and only one person going in, maybe we're okay with that. That was the tradition for a while. Now what are we down to? We're down to a mask and hand sanitizer because we know this thing's airborne. Nothing's going to stop it. Nothing will stop it. But you can protect others as you contract the virus from other patients. You prevent yourself from spreading the COVID virus, the coronavirus. And so we've got to kind of boil down over the past, we're almost at 12 months right now. It'll be 12, 13 months at the end of this month when we first started becoming aware of it last year, where we've gone full circle from complete protection to let's look at the data, now maybe we don't need all this stuff. And things have loosened up. Excuse me, that's my COVID getting ready. Yeah, mop gear, you're exactly right, Tim. You know the words. Yeah, mop is what we use in the military. Regarding the concept of cabulance, what are some possible ways to address the issue of certain individuals, such as the homeless and the indigent, using ambulances as taxis? As long as you got a bunch of lawyers running around the world and you got the feds standing there beating a drum for EMTALA, in other words, pour every single resource in every single person, no matter what, you're going to have a hard time refusing transport of those patients unless you do a very thorough medical screening exam. For instance, you arrive on the scene of a homeless person who's 30 years old, who's laying on the sidewalk. He's responsive, tells you he's not feeling well, he has muscle aches, body aches, he's been running a fever, and it's been going on for the past 2 weeks. If your medical director's got a set of cojones and your chiefs are probably got some SOPs in place, you get out, you do a vital sign check, pulse oximetry, blood pressure, get an EKG if you want, it doesn't matter. And then decide from the vital signs if this is something that you want to move to the hospital. We tend to be a little bit more liberal with the persons who don't have the resources to get them to medical care. So I have to be honest with you, that's all so nebulous and up in the air right now that even with priority dispatch, you tell the homeless person, gee, based on your symptoms, you might not get an ambulance there for a couple hours. So you may either call a cab, walk, or wait. I mean, that's about all you can do. What are you going to do one day? And let's get philosophical for a second, since we're just about wrapped up EMS operations. What are you going to do one day when every city, every major city in the country starts defunding the fire departments or defunding EMS? And you've only got, for instance, the city of Chicago has 65 ambulances running around the city doing 280,000 calls a year. Well, what happens if the political situation, political environment up there where they say, hey, we have to cut money from someplace. We've already defunded the police, brilliant move. Now we're shooting 800 people a year. But all of a sudden, instead of 65 ambulances, you got 30 ambulances. At what point do you start telling people enough's enough? We just can't do it. And then what happens after 2 years when I've got you on a 24 and 48 and you're doing 20, 25 runs a day? What happens after the second year of you being on the job? Yeah, you're on fire, man. It's what they call burnt out. And the reason why the turnover rate in New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Baltimore, Miami, the average paramedic lasts about 2 years in the field, and then they're out. And subsequently, how can we continue training paramedics and expect to have experienced paramedics out there? Excuse me. How are we going to have an experienced level of competent paramedics, 10-year, 12-year, 15-year paramedics, if we keep burning them out? And what does the future look like? And so it's incumbent upon us to start being good stewards of our resources. However, that too has become a political football. And depending on what party is in office at the time will determine whether we continue the nanny state, providing all resources to everybody no matter what, versus, hey, maybe we got to drop back a little bit and start preserving some of this stuff. And as it was brought out a little bit earlier, is that priority dispatch, I think, is a nice baby step sneaking into the day when we finally have to turn around and say, sorry, no ambulance is available. Goodbye. Click. I hope we never hit that spot. But I got to tell you, we're closer to that than we are getting better. Okay, mop year, bring back great memories. Yeah, it does. Tim, I hated mop gear. Even as an officer, even as a bird colonel, you get into those things, and especially at my age, because when you get to be deputy commanders and commanders, we're not spring chickens anymore. Subsequently, getting in and out of mop gear, It doesn't make it, especially for a guy like me where they store all that stuff in high humidity environments and it shrinks the waistline on a lot of the mop gear. It's horrible. I hate it. Okay. Operating the ambulance, be tolerant of other drivers. Boom. Never drive while under the influence of any substance. Oh, all right. There's a news flash. You know there's liability here. And you have to be found grossly negligent, not just merely negligent. Grossly negligent as a municipal worker, as an EMS personnel, because most states, if not all, has very strong paramedic EMT laws that say you can't just be merely negligent. You can't just be 51% at your fault. You have to be 70 or 75% at fault. I mean, grossly negligent. Reckless disregard is the legal term. And subsequently, if you drive an ambulance while under the influence, that certainly qualifies as grossly negligent. Now, you know the highest standard from a criminal law standpoint is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's 99.99%. Right? That's not what we look for in the civil world. If you're under the influence, if you're taking even Ambien the night before and it gets found out, or if your department has an SOP that says if you're in an accident or you're part of an accident, then you get drug tested, blood tested, breathalyzer, the whole shot, interviewed by a counselor. And if anything shows up, if anything lights up positive, you're hosed. Your department's hosed. And then everybody's putting on an orange apron and not doing red patches anymore, but they're going to go work for Home Depot because they're not going to be paramedics anymore. No state agency in this country has a sense of humor for a driver or a paramedic who's doing their job while under the influence of a medication, even prescribed. Okay. You know, I included these 4 points here when we were writing this stuff for Pearson. We included the 4 points here because you may look at that and go, Jesus, really, Dr. Frame, you got to state that? I mean, isn't this kind of intuitive? And the answer is yes, it is. And the reason why we put it in there is out of necessity, because even though you get it, somebody didn't get it, which prompted the slide. Will you see this on the exam? No. You may see the 4th bullet. Now, I do want to make a caveat for that. A self-honest, unbiased assessment of your own capabilities is paramount. You have to be scrupulously honest with yourself to say, am I the best person to be behind the wheel right now? And even if I am the best person to be behind the wheel, am I impaired? So impaired doesn't necessarily mean that you've been doing drugs or alcohol. It could mean, well, you were up the whole night before and you're on a mandatory, now you're on a 48, and boy, I'm the driver, engineer, or operator, or whatever it is that you call yourselves these days in the fire service. Am I the best person who should be driving 26 tons of apparatus with 3 or 4 other people in my engine or in my ambulance? Am I putting somebody at risk? Some of the EMS operation questions will ask you for a self-assessment, and they'll ask you for the qualities that you need to possess to make that self-assessment. Like, am I honest? Am I acting in the best interest of the company that I'm working for, the municipality, whatever it is? Have I reported that up the chain? Put it on the lieutenant or put it on your supervisor. Hey, look, we did a 24 yesterday. I'm on a mandatory 48 right now, and we were up all night. I don't know that I can drive this thing. I think most people would have a great amount of respect for you if you did that. And they're going to ask you that question on the exam in some shape or form. Be alert for the question that has you making a self-assessment based on the 4th bullet down there. Personal stress, illness, and fatigue. when I get into the law, as you may or may not know, in addition to being a physician, I'm a lawyer. And subsequently, uh, when I teach law, it's about standards of care, but it's about expectations that the public has of firefighters, paramedics, EMTs. Everybody in the fire service, everybody that are first responders, which include our police colleagues, are expected to function at a higher standard. You drive your own personal car and you accidentally swerve over a lane or something like that, you're negligent. You're doing some texting, you're doing whatever it was that causes these things, whatever cockpit distraction that you have. And yet, if that same thing happens in an ambulance, it's not just negligence, it's gross negligence. What were you doing? I was texting. I text all the time. I text in my car. Every single day I was texting while I was driving to an ambulance call. And the courts are going to turn around and say, do it in your own car. But in an ambulance, in a fire engine, you'll be slapped down pretty bad. And your insurance carrier is going to be absolutely thrilled with you. And the people that they underwrite, like your municipality. Okay. Certain privileges. Now, this is understanding the law, and this was put in because it goes back to what I said a little bit earlier in the lecture, is that if you're doing 70 miles per hour versus 60 miles per hour, okay, on an open 6-lane highway, maybe you can get away with it. Subdivision, probably not. 2-lane highway, definitely not. You're not going to be able to get away with that kind of speed. So don't break the speed limit unless there's extraordinary circumstances where you have to break that speed limit. And even then, 5 miles per hour, 10 miles per hour, where you're going to save time isn't doing 60 or 70 miles per hour. Hell, you're still moving forward. You're still moving. Where we tend to get tied up from a time standpoint on a transport is when we have to stop. When you're stationary, you're going to lose a whole lot of time. So emergency vehicles have been given the privilege, not the right, the privilege to go safely through an intersection against the red light, or to cross over into an opposite lane of traffic to get around all the traffic as you're approaching an intersection. You're given the privilege, not the right. Because if you're in the opposite lane of traffic and you're involved in an accident, guess who it's on? You're going to have to show that the civilian out there was grossly negligent because all they were doing was turning a corner. Next thing you know, they got this ambulance coming through the intersection at whatever miles per hour, never stopped or anything. The ambulance will be liable, which means the driver is liable. And under respondeat superior, your employer is responsible for your actions. Subsequently, you can be penalized. The state agency loves to get involved with those things. They love penalizing paramedics for doing stupid things. And driving fast through an intersection without slowing down or stopping is stupid. So on the National Registry, they're not going to use my language that says, gee, you were stupid. What they're going to say is that you violated a privilege, but you do not have a right to speed. You do not have a right to blow intersections. And most importantly, you can never, ever go around a school bus while their sign is out and the red lights are flashing. Period. You go around the bus driver like that. If the bus driver wants you to go around and he says it's safe, he retracts his stop sign, he shuts off the red lights, he may still leave the yellow warnings on there, and then he has to wave you around. And unless you get all three, you're not going anywhere around that school bus. while it stopped with red flashing lights and the stop sign out the window or out the side, wherever they do that. That you will see as a mandatory bank question is, what is the one privilege you're never allowed to exercise? It's going to be going around flashing red lights school bus with the stop sign out. Okay.
Dr. Frame, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
In the Marine Corps, we had a requirement for drivers. They had to have a certain amount of sleep before they could drive in convoys and such. Is there any kind of medical recommendation of amount of sleep that's necessary over a certain amount of period for emergency vehicle drivers?
No, there's no such regulation. They leave that regulation up by SOP. Now, if you're a common carrier, such as a ship captain or a airplane pilot, there are mandatory rest hours. Now, in the Air Force, we had mandatory rest. You couldn't fly for more than 6 hours without a 2-hour rest in between, which meant you fly 50 minutes, break for 10, fly for 2 hours, break for 30 kind of thing. And you can never bust 10 hours straight. In the Marine Corps, you probably had the same thing, especially with your chopper pilots or the F-18 pilots, were the same way. They probably couldn't get more than 4 hours, which is why when we flew sorties, and even when the Marines flew sorties with us in Iraq and Afghanistan, they were limited to 2 hours. And sometimes 4 if there was some, anticipated action going on someplace. But that was a wartime waiver that the commander, the squadron commander, or in your case, corps commander, aviation commander, had to authorize. And then he better have been right. But for what happens with common carriers, ship captains, airline captains and such, no such hours restrictions exist for apparatus operators and drivers.
Thank you.
How do you advise that we work on our skill sheets? Sydney, that's probably the only question that's going to stump me tonight. And Jane and I and the rest of the people at the colleges, where I medical direct as well, and fire departments have been wrestling with this question for the past 13 months since COVID hit, is how do we get everybody through skills? We can't have the big 10 paramedic gaggle of people coming into the college to start IVs on each other anymore. That's been restricted. We can't have the big size classes that we want, where you split the classes up into 3 sections so that you could take the National Registry skill sheet and practice because of COVID. So, yet when we went to dishes and asked them, Jesus, there's some of the skill sheets that we can waive, some clinicals we could waive, maybe some run requirements, 240 hours in a fire station over a month or 2, that's 10, 24-hour shifts. That's crazy. And yet, with the fire departments cutting back as they don't want people to come in, they're not even getting their ambulance ride-outs done. The clinical times in the hospitals have been cut down to virtually 0, and forget OB. They lost their minds worse than the New Jersey Democrat. They just went crazy, and every OB unit throughout the country shut down to anybody but mommy, mandatory participant, and dad, maybe. They didn't even allow the dads in them anymore. And of course, the nursing staff and the physician. So where do we get all these skills? How do we test our students? How do we verify their competencies? Most importantly, how do we work with you? And the answer to that is, we don't know. we haven't gotten any guidance from anybody, and all the suggestions we have put forward have been categorically rejected in the name of COVID.
Can I step in here for a second to help you out there, Dr. Frame?
Yeah.
Sydney, I know you're in the EMT class. Fortunately, with the way that we're structured, we've been very fortunate because our groups are always small and always have been. And with the way the course is structured and you're studying now, you're going through, you have skill sheets to memorize before you go, you're watching videos, you're learning all the content. So that when you go to that small skills session that we'll have for you in Abilene, where there will not be that many students, as long as you've done that preparation, you'll be able to do exactly like you were doing before, because we're set up differently than the colleges and some of the larger groups. It is a small group, and you'll get plenty of hands-on practice and plenty of opportunity to actually work and practice and then test those. And then as Dr. Frame said, when you get into the rotation environments, that's where we're having more issue because the clinical sites change by the day. You know, which ones are letting students in today may not be letting in students in tomorrow. And it has been fun. And like Dr. Frame said, we haven't had a lot of guidance, but we have had some very good meetings. We've been able to shift things around so that you will be able to do things at alternate departments. It's a little slower, but you know, we still have people graduating every few days. So just take a breath. We feel fortunate because we were structured in such a way that COVID, while it impacted us, did not impact us, make things that much different than before. So you'll be fine.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The online programs tolerated this easier because that's what we've been doing for years. But the colleges, boy, they took a beating. They were running around there for a while trying to figure out how they're going to graduate people. And there's still classes going on out there that were supposed to be 9, 10, 12 months that have already extended out to 2 years now, and they still haven't graduated a class. I mean, it's tough, Sydney, but Hercom's got a pretty good handle on what we're doing with this, and keep the numbers small, keep the practice sessions with the instructors and with just 2 people only, you know, your partner and yourself. And it's worked for us at Hercom. They've done pretty good. We're not going to lose you. Okay, at the end of this slide, driving fast on wet pavements. They ask you for a definition of hydroplaning. It shows up on many, but not all exams. It's not part of the mandatory bank, but you could very well get a question that says, what's hydroplaning? So make sure you look it up. But essentially what it is your tires have lost contact with the road because there's a nice thin layer of water in between the tire and the road. And the next thing you know, you're skiing. You're not driving, you're skiing. And you're gonna go where the wave takes you, if you will. And unfortunately, the wave takes you into bad places. So, okay. And I didn't see any of this stuff here on any of the white sheets that we get from the National Registry that says, hey, we're going to test this real heavily. So yeah, there is. Andrew, you asked a good question there. Forced fire suppression is probably the toughest of all the suppression activities. Any good fire chief will tell you, any experienced fire chief will tell you that the most dangerous fire out there is wildland. It's one thing to pull up. You can surround a fire, a structure fire, even if it's a big structure, you can at least surround it. Wildfires, good luck with that. 50, 60, 70,000 acres, it's crazy. When we were doing aerial firefighting out of Montana, we were using the C-130s up there. We have 10 C-130s in the Air Force that are specifically for firefighting. Our ratios were 4 hours of flying, and then you had to be off 8 hours of unencumbered rest. And you had there was mandatory sleep time. So we do that with our pilots, especially in a firefighting situation. We give them Ambien or temazepam to go to sleep, and then we kind of sort of wake them back up again with stimulants, phenylephrine being one in the military. Is how we get everybody in sleep cycles. You're up, you're down, you're up, you're down, you're up, you're down. Since that's not really allowed in the civilian sector, you have to go to more aggressive ratios of sleep. And the reason for that is a circadian rhythm in any person who's involved with these kind of activities actually goes on a 16 and 8. As a matter of fact, that's how we train doctors now. Back in my day, we would be on 48-hour call, and at the end of your 48 hours, you're usually found in the locker room laying down on the shower floor puking your guts out because you haven't had any sleep in 48 hours. I don't know how they expected us to treat patients. With you guys doing fire suppression and the amount of actual muscle exertion that's going on, if you're not well hydrated, anything longer than 12 to 16 hours is going to make you a setup for rhabdomyolysis. So the short answer to your question, Andrew, is there a medical basis for these ratios? And the answer is electrolyte depletion, volume depletion, and then when it gets severe, renal insufficiency and rhabdomyolysis, seizures, coma, and death. So the ratios are set up to mitigate that. And I use the word mitigate. I don't use prevent. Nothing to prevent that except a good aggressive exercise and diet program for when that time comes when you firefighters have to get out there for a long time carrying lots of stuff over unpleasant terrain in intense heat. You know, that's a setup for disaster. So subsequently, the short answer is yes, there's a medical basis for it. First 24 hours, we tend to bring out water to firefighters and such are on incidents longer than 8 hours. After 24 hours, however, it starts becoming an electrolyte situation. You're going to start losing sodium and potassium. Muscles are going to cramp. You're going to get into heat cramps. Sometimes if you're out there, if you're not conditioned properly and such, you get into heat syncope. You pass out, bring you into the ambulance, cool you off, you wake back up again. Hopefully you're done for the day. You're going to need probably 12 and possibly 24 hours out if you get into a heat syncope situation. But heat exhaustion, heat stroke, man, we're still dropping guys from heat exhaustion, heat stroke. And people think that, well, maybe heat stroke, altered mental status plus lack of sweating plus red face plus intense heat, altered mental status being the major symptom that distinguishes heat stroke from heat exhaustion. You'll find that it's a very fine line, and one could even argue it's a continuum, that between heat exhaustion and heat stroke, you can jump into rhabdomyolysis. Once you start getting muscle breakdown, the muscle, the myoglobin itself, gets into the kidneys and forms casts. And what I mean by casts is actual plaster casts. And subsequently, without an appropriate amount of fluid and alkalosis going through those kidneys, casts form. And of course, there's no way to salvage the kidney at that point. You've clogged up every nephron in the kidney and you're in renal failure. That pretty much ends a firefighting career at that point. So short answer, yes, the ratios are there for lots of good reasons and should be strictly adhered to. Okay. Transferring the patient to the ambulance. Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to stop here. I have another session with you. It won't be next week because I just found out today that I'm December 11th, I have to be in an advanced trauma life support class for physicians. Subsequently, it's a job requirement. And although I initially scheduled to have a roundtable with you, it doesn't look like I'm going to make it. So I'll probably rejoin you, good folks, right around the first or second week of January. So, does anybody have any questions before we break off for the evening?
Just so everybody knows, we do have some MD roundtable. I think we have Dr. Phillips and Dr. Eschelbach, who also are on the calendar for this month.
Yes. Yeah, God knows.
Before winter break.
Yeah, we would never survive without those two guys, and they're a wealth of knowledge. They're smarter than I am. But
I think you're all wonderful, and the students are benefiting. I just wanted to make sure everybody remembers. So the session that Dr. Frame has is listed for the 11th is the one he's talking about. I was talking to Dr. Phillips to see if he wanted to take it, but he gets off in Texarkana at 6 and then has to drive all the way home, which is west of Fort Worth. So I don't think that's going to work out. So we'll probably have to cancel that one.
Well, I wish you all the best. I got part 3 and part 4 of EMS operations before we're done with this big section. I encourage you once again to pull up these videos because we do record these and put them online for you to peruse at your own time. If you're having an argument around the fire station and said, well, Dr. Frame said this, well, you can pull it back up again and you can show your colleagues what's new, current, and cutting edge in EMS operations and how the law interacts with EMS operations. So I still got 2 more sessions with you on EMS operations. In the meantime, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. I'm registered at Tiffany's. You can send me jewelry for that. Not hard to please with jewelry. So,
all right.
All right, guys. You guys take care.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.